I always find it interesting when a panel sets somebody up for a political ambush and it completely backfires, because Antoine Seawright turned this so-called Democratic autopsy discussion into a fact-checking session that clearly caught Katie Pavlich off guard. Welcome back, everybody. Make sure you subscribe, comment where you're watching from, and tell me your thoughts, because this conversation ended very abruptly once the actual election numbers started coming up. NewsNation's Katie Pavlich appeared completely caught off guard after Democratic strategist Antoine Seawright flipped the script during what was clearly supposed to be a 3-on-1 pile-on against Democrats. The panel, which also featured conservative radio host Joe Pagliarulo and former advisor to Margaret Thatcher Niall Gardner, centered around a Democratic autopsy report following the 2024 election. But instead of accepting the framing that Democrats are collapsing, Seawright pointed out that Democrats have consistently overperformed expectations in elections since Donald Trump returned to office. The moment Katie Pavlich dismissed those victories by saying narratives are not wins, Seawright immediately began pushing back with actual election results, only for Pavlich to abruptly cut him off and end the segment before he could finish making his case. I definitely have some thoughts about how this segment wrapped up, so stay tuned.
It's now to discuss Antoine Seawright. He is a Democratic strategist. Joe Pagliarulo, host of the Joe Pag Show. Joe Pags is here. And Niall Gardner, conservative commentator and former senior advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here tonight. So, Antoine, let's start with you. Just your response to this report, almost 200 pages long. You're a Democrat. What's your assessment?
I don't think we need this distraction. We have an affordability crisis in America brought to you and sponsored by your neighborhood Republican Party. You had a Republican congressman just today said that January 6th was all made up. We have a healthcare crisis in this country. I think there are other things we can be talking about as Democrats instead of looking back retrospectively. Now, I always subscribe to the notion two things happen in campaigns: you win or you learn. Obviously, we did not win, so there's some things we can learn, but I don't think this autopsy was the best use of our time, and I certainly don't think it's the best use of a limited oxygen political space.
So, Joe, you know, the rules in politics are if your opponent is doing something that helps you and benefits you, just don't step in the way. What did you think about reading this autopsy and assessment of the DNC, which, by the way, doesn't have any money going into an election year?
Katie, thanks for having me on. I noticed that Antoine, who I respect a lot, didn't say anything about the autopsy. He complained about Republicans. That's kind of interesting. I would have looked at this autopsy and said, wow, they forgot to say that Kamala Harris was a horrible candidate. They forgot to mention that we picked a horrible guy for vice president, the guy who's overseeing, I guess, massive fraud over in Minnesota. So listen, I respect the fact that they tried to come to some conclusion about what happened, but leaving out the cognitive decline of the then president, leaving out the fact that he ran and then he didn't run, and then leaving out the fact that Kamala Harris was a horrendous candidate. She didn't accomplish anything, not the one thing that she was asked to do about the border. So I think that I'm glad that there's a whole lot of nothing here, because I don't think the Democrat Party is going to learn. And Antoine's not wrong. You know, you can pick out what you don't like about the other party if you want, but I think a little deep reflection on the Democratic side would be scary for us conservatives. So go ahead and keep on denying. I like it.
So, Niall, you, of course, worked with one of the greatest leaders of all time, Margaret Thatcher. She was, you know, she always talked about socialism. Socialism's great until you run out of other people's money. What I found in the report and reading through it is that this is the Democratic establishment, right? And we're seeing the Democratic Socialists of America, which is essentially the insurgent wing of the Democratic Party, the Mamdanis, these far-left candidates that we're seeing winning primaries across the country. They really are offering, even though it's incorrect and a terrible form of governance, socialism and communism as a policy prescription for what they're seeing and the issues that Americans are facing out there. So even though they're wrong, are they somewhat correct in actually speaking to the issues rather than what this report does, which is completely ignore everything that Americans voted for in 2024?
Well, I think that, so without a doubt, I mean, the left in the United States are in complete denial and also disarray. And on both sides of the Atlantic, in fact, we're seeing socialists in real trouble. And in Britain, Keir Starmer, the socialist prime minister, has been an absolute disaster, probably the worst prime minister, I think, in British history. And you are literally seeing the British government fall apart right now. And this is the result of far left policies and ideology. And in the United States, without a doubt, I mean, I think that you know, the Democrats really are suffering from a clear lack of, you know, crystal clear policies and thinking. They are driven by frankly, Trump derangement syndrome. They're full of, hate, I think, for the president and for anyone who supports him. There's no fresh thinking on the left at all. And also, you had a candidate last time, the presidential election, Kamala Harris, who was a complete disaster, and in fact, a real embarrassment in so many respects. And so, the reality is that we are witnessing on both sides of the Atlantic the left in complete and utter disarray, and socialism never works. Right. Socialism, frankly, just drags countries down and destroys them.
As you said, it's not a new idea. Socialism, communism is not a fresh idea for any society. In fact, it's caused a lot of human suffering in the countries and times when it's been tried and failed. But Antoine, I mean, you call this a distraction. There are pages and pages, and it is distracting. I mean, there's lots of corrections. There are lots of red boxes that say no evidence provided for this. This doesn't consistently support this claim. No sourcing provided. No even conclusion on this report. But how is the Democratic Party supposed to move forward with infrastructure to win in races across the country if they can't get on the same page about what issues matter the most, and they can't even trust the DNC chair to put this out without these edits being made? I mean, do you have confidence in the DNC chair? Or do you think someone else should take over?
Katie, I love how you and your guests try to frame Democrats in disarray when we've outperformed every single narrative since Donald Trump has taken office.
Well, narratives are not wins. So,
well, I can tell you, we have proof in the wins. 30+ elections we've won, including places where Donald Trump won up and down the ballot all over the country. That's not narrative, that's fact. We've also outperformed the expected showing up of voters all across the country in those elections. That's how we got to where we are in terms of our success. Mm-hmm. The other thing I say, we gotta run.
Joe, 10 seconds to you.
Listen, I love it. I hope that he continues to be in denial. I would love this. Please run Kamala Harris again in 2028. I would love that. Please pick Tim Walz as the vice president again, because you guys obviously have no issues. It's all about the Republicans.
All right, y'all, we got to run. We will talk about this from now until November. Appreciate all of you for joining me tonight. Thank you very much.
What made this entire segment so revealing is that it perfectly captured one of the biggest weaknesses in modern conservative media strategy right now. Republicans are extremely comfortable talking at Democrats, but the second Democrats start pushing back with actual electoral data and political reality, the conversation suddenly gets shut down. That's exactly what happened to Katie Pavlich here. This segment was very obviously designed to frame Democrats as a party in collapse. That was the entire structure of the discussion from the beginning. You had a conservative host, 2 conservative guests, and 1 Democrat isolated on the panel in what was basically set up to become a coordinated lecture about how terrible Democrats are, how socialism is destroying the left, how Kamala Harris was a disaster, how Republicans are dominating politically, and how Democrats supposedly learned nothing from 2024. That was the script. But the problem is Antoine Seawright didn't play along with the framing. And that's where everything changed. Because instead of getting trapped defending every mistake Democrats made in 2024, Seawright immediately pivoted toward the actual political reality Republicans do not want discussed right now. Democrats have consistently overperformed expectations in election after election since Donald Trump returned to office. That's a fact. Republicans hate talking about because it directly undermines the narrative that Trump's return created some unstoppable MAGA political realignment. And notice what happened the second Seawright brought it up. Katie Pavlich immediately dismissed those victories as narratives. But then Seawright started to respond with specifics. He started talking about actual election wins, actual turnout, actual overperformance, actual races. And suddenly the segment ended almost instantly. That wasn't accidental timing. That was political damage control.
Because conservative media thrives when Democrats are discussed abstractly as weak, radical, incompetent, divided, or out of touch. But once the conversation becomes grounded in actual election outcomes, Republicans start running into a very uncomfortable problem. Despite all the media noise, despite all the nonstop Democrats are doomed narratives, Democrats have remained far more competitive electorally than conservatives expected. And Republicans know that. That's why even Joe Pagliarulo accidentally gave away the real fear conservatives have during the segment. His most honest moment came when he admitted that if Democrats actually course correct and seriously reflect on their mistakes, it would become scary for conservatives. That line mattered, Because buried underneath all the smugness and partisan attacks was a genuine admission. Republicans understand that much of their current political advantage depends on Democrats remaining disorganized, uninspiring, or internally divided. That's the part conservative commentators rarely say out loud. The modern Republican coalition under Trump is not operating from a position of complete political security. In many ways, it's operating from permanent grievance, permanent outrage, and permanent cultural warfare, because those are the things that keep the coalition emotionally energized. But electorally, Republicans still face major vulnerabilities, especially when voters start focusing on issues like affordability, healthcare, corruption, abortion rights, democratic institutions, and economic inequality. And Seawright smartly redirected the conversation back toward those kitchen table issues immediately. That's why his opening answer frustrated them so much. Instead of spending the segment apologizing for Democratic failures, he pointed directly at the affordability crisis and tied it to Republican governance. That instantly disrupted the intended flow of the conversation, because Republicans wanted a post-mortem discussion about Democratic incompetence, not a discussion about what voters are currently experiencing economically under Trump-era politics. And honestly, this is becoming a recurring problem for conservative media personalities like Katie Pavlich.
They increasingly rely on controlled environments where the framing itself does most of the work. The assumption is that if enough conservatives are on the panel and the host controls the pacing, Democrats can be boxed into defensive positions. But that strategy falls apart when someone calmly redirects attention back toward measurable political outcomes and real-world issues affecting voters. That's why Pavlich cutting Seawright off looked so bad. Because audiences can recognize when someone is being prevented from finishing a point, especially when the interruption comes right as they begin listing factual examples that challenge the narrative being pushed by the host. And viewers notice patterns. People notice that conservative hosts often allow long, uninterrupted monologues from Republican guests, but suddenly become short on time the moment a Democrat starts gaining momentum. That imbalance damages credibility because it creates the impression that the conversation was never meant to be a genuine debate in the first place. And honestly, another revealing aspect of this discussion was how aggressively the conservative side tried to frame Democrats as socialists and communists while completely avoiding scrutiny of what Republicans are actually doing right now. Because while they spent the segment ranting about socialism, many Americans are currently worried about healthcare costs, housing costs, corporate greed, wealth inequality, cuts to public programs, political corruption, and government favoritism toward the wealthy. That disconnect matters politically. Republicans still often campaign like it's the Cold War, throwing around words like socialism as universal conversation-ending attacks, but younger voters especially are increasingly focused less on ideological labels and more on whether their lives are materially improving. Can they afford rent? Can they afford healthcare? Can they pay for groceries? Can they survive economically?
And if Republicans cannot provide convincing answers to those questions, culture war rhetoric alone eventually starts losing effectiveness outside the hardcore base. That's part of why Democrats have continued outperforming expectations in many elections despite all the problems within the party itself. And the irony here is that the conservative guests on the panel accidentally highlighted Democratic opportunities without even realizing it. They spent enormous amounts of time talking about Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Democratic messaging failures, DNC dysfunction. But notice how little substantive defense there actually was of current Republican governance itself. Very little discussion about lowering costs, very little discussion about improving healthcare access, very little discussion about wages, very little discussion about corruption concerns, very little discussion about everyday Americans struggling economically. Instead, much of the segment revolved around mocking Democrats and celebrating perceived Democratic weakness. That works inside partisan media bubbles, but nationally, that strategy becomes much riskier when voters start demanding actual results. And that's why Seawright's pushback was politically effective. He understood that Republicans desperately want Democrats trapped in endless internal blame games instead of talking about current Republican vulnerabilities. The second Democrats start pivoting toward economic frustration, corruption concerns, and the real-world consequences of Trump-era governance, Republicans lose the comfort of fighting symbolic culture war battles on favorable terrain. And honestly, the segment also exposed something else important. Modern conservative media increasingly treats interruption itself as a political weapon. When arguments become uncomfortable, they interrupt. When facts become inconvenient, they pivot. When narratives collapse, they end the segment. That's why so many Republican lawmakers now avoid town halls entirely, because unscripted interactions create risk. Once voters begin directly challenging politicians on healthcare, corruption, affordability, or broken promises, the carefully controlled messaging environment starts breaking apart. And that fear is visible.
It's visible in the shortened interviews. It's visible in the interruptions. It's visible in the aggressive pivots. It's visible in the obsession with changing subjects before uncomfortable discussions fully develop. Because underneath all the confidence, many Republicans understand they are governing during a period of deep public frustration and instability. And if Democrats ever become disciplined enough to consistently focus on those frustrations instead of getting distracted by internal chaos, Republicans could absolutely face major political problems moving forward. That's the deeper significance of Joe Pag's comment. He basically admitted conservatives are rooting for Democrats to stay confused because a focused Democratic Party would become far more dangerous electorally. And honestly, that may have been the single most truthful thing said during the entire segment. Because despite all the conservative celebration happening on television right now, Republicans know very well that political momentum can change extremely quickly in modern American politics, especially when economic anxiety, corruption concerns, and voter exhaustion start outweighing partisan loyalty. That's why Katie Pavlich abruptly ending the interview mattered so much. Not because Seawright delivered some earth-shattering line, not because Democrats suddenly solved all their problems, but because for a brief moment, the carefully controlled narrative broke down and an uncomfortable reality started entering the conversation. Republicans may not be nearly as politically untouchable as conservative media keeps pretending they are.